A couple of weeks ago, I actually just bought the Fuji X100 Mark VI. In reality, it's not the actual camera that I wanted, but in 2025, it's the most closest to perfect camera that I could find for my needs. The camera I truly wanted to buy, but I just can't justify in 2025 is the RX1R Mark II. I have previously owned the RX1 series. Way back in the day, I had the original RX1, and in fact, I've actually owned it twice. The first time I had it, it lasted a couple months in my bag, but the AF was just so frustratingly slow. I remember being on holiday with it, just trying to capture some very simple, slow shots, but the autofocus, how it would work is it would just pass through the plane of focus and then hunt a little bit, and that hunting was always very irritating. At that point, I decided to give up on the camera and I ended up just selling it. But then a couple of years later, I still desired having the full frame camera in my pocket. So at that point, I decided to go again, give it another shot, and I purchased another one used. And what I will say, one of the best things about the RX1 series is the fact that it's not widely popular and it's not widely available, so it really holds its value very well. I remember back then, the original used one that I had sold on the used market for about £1,000, and then a couple of years later when I did buy it, it was like 850. And even today in 2025, the original Mark I is around £700 to £800 depending on its condition. Either way, back then I had like a love-hate relationship with the original RX1. Taking the cost factor out of the equation, it was just using it and living it day to day. I just found it really frustrating, and it didn't suit my style of shooting. But I did love the fact that it was small, compact, and I love the image quality coming out of it, especially during that time. When the RX1R Mark II came out a couple of years later and introduced face detection autofocus, I really did want to give it a go, but I couldn't quite justify it because the price on the used market especially was way more expensive than I ever wanted to invest into a camera for that one specific purpose. When it comes to buying cameras and lenses, I don't flinch too much with price because it's for a professional reason that I buy it for. However, with the RX1R Mark II, it's purely going to be for personal use, and spending over £2,000 on a camera for personal use, earning no income from it, it's just a tough pill to swallow. Some of the reviews back then, despite actually now touting that it's got face detection autofocus, they stated that the performance of the autofocus was not that much better than the original RX1. So the RX1R Mark II has always been one of those cameras that I've just admired from a distance, that I always wanted to buy but just couldn't justify doing it. But recently I was actually just scrolling on Facebook Marketplace and I saw an RX1R Mark II for sale. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the best condition, and in fact the screen also was broken at the bottom. The screen itself visually, like you can see the pixels, and that area of the screen was perfectly fine. It was the outer casing that was the problem. Granted, for a 10-year-old camera, I wouldn't expect perfect condition, but that crack was just probably a little bit too far for me. But then I did notice that the price of it was actually coming down a little bit, so I'm guessing the seller was struggling to sell. So I did think to myself, maybe at a low enough price I could live with that crack on the screen. So what I ended up doing was actually just messaging him just to see if he would be open to actually meeting up so I can actually get some test shots and just try out for myself, hold up my hands and visually see it for myself to see if I could live with that type of damage. And at the point of recording this video, I'm still on the fence. I'm recording this video on a Saturday and I'm going to be sending off the images of the damage to a repair center on Monday to see if I can get a quote to see how much they would charge to repair the screen. Because if it is something that is repairable, I may actually just take the plunge and pay for the repair, and hopefully overall it still work out cheaper. And if I find that it's not repairable at all even, then it's probably something that I won't even move forward with. But aside from the actual damage on the camera, I really did enjoy using it for that short period of time. The single point autofocus performance was actually pretty usable for me. It was just a quick test, but the reviews made it out like there wasn't that much improvement at all. But I did actually find myself not really getting frustrated at using single point focus. I was testing the camera in a lowly lit cafe, and in all fairness, I was only testing it on very static objects. But with a camera like this, I'm not trying to capture fastest moving speed in action. But in my short time using it, the one thing that I did pick up on was that the metering was a bit erratic. This is not a huge problem if you shoot manual, you could be dialing your settings manually and be locked in. But in my personal life, I don't really want to faff around too much with all this. I kind of like the idea of having the aperture set to where I want it to get the image look, a minimum shutter so I'm not getting motion blur, and I'll just let the camera just choose whatever ISO it needs. For the most part, it's never too far off, and if I do need to adjust anything in post, so be it. But the RX1R Mark II, I found it was actually quite off. There was a couple of shots that it just darkened down massively and I didn't understand why. Granted, with a camera that's about 10 years old at this point, it's hard to tell whether that's actually a faulty unit or if that's just a performance that was set from way back in the day and I'm just now spoiled by new metering technology. And then the other thing I noticed as well on the back of the screen is that the colors were just wacky on the RX1R Mark II. I do remember criticism on the Sony colors back in that era, but I suppose because we moved on from it and I've kind of forgotten about it and got used to modern day technology, I've forgotten how bad it was. One of the arguments is that you just shoot raw and you can tweak the colors in post. But honestly, just looking at the back of the screen, there's a very green tinge. Just over a year ago, I actually purchased the A7C II with 35mm f1.8 to try and replicate that small, compact, full frame type of camera. But as I mentioned on my X100 Mark VI unboxing video, the 35mm f1.8 protrudes so much more than the X100, and still even more so than the 35mm f2 on the RX1R Mark II. But there's something about that 35mm f2 lens that is mounted permanently to the RX1, it's just the rendering and the bokeh is just so incredibly soft and creamy. I managed to get a couple sample shots and I'm only comparing it to my RX100 Mark VI, but if we move over to Lightroom, here you'll see that this is the RX1R Mark II shot and this is the Fuji X100 Mark VI. I do prefer the color tone of the X100 Mark VI, but the dreaminess of the 35mm f2 on the RX1R Mark II, it just looks so good. Overall, I'm still on the fence, and I've only just recently got the X100 Mark VI, so I do feel like I probably need to spend a bit more time with that before I make any jumps. But I've always had this consistent feeling ever since the RX1R Mark II came out that I've wanted one. But unfortunately, logic is telling me in 2025, it's not a camera for me to buy today. The RX1R Mark II on the used market is being sold for about £1,600 to £1,800. On MPB at the moment, it's between £1,900 to £2,100. And at those prices, I'm just going to consider the camera a write-off. I do regard it as a classic camera, but spending that amount of money on 2015 technology is just a bit too much for me personally. But this decision is largely based off the amount of disposable income there is. This is very much just a personal choice of mine, but let me know down below if you own this camera and if you feel it's worth buying in 2025. Following on from that though, the one that I'm actually looking at is actually much cheaper than market rate, but there is that significant damage to the screen. So I'm still sitting on the fence on whether I'm actually going to take the plunge with that camera, and I'll probably follow up in a week or two on my decision, and depending on the repairability and its cost for that damage to the screen. But let me know down below what you think of either of these cameras.